You know, season 1 is fast approaching for Diablo 4, and I want to take the time today to go over the tier list that I think of all the individual classes, just to put them in perspective so that players who are possibly looking to try new classes who haven't done it in the preseason, they can kind of come here and just get my thoughts and impressions of it. I think I have a fairly good grasp of all the classes as I've played every single one of them to World Tier 4 at the very least. Some I've gotten to 100, some I've gotten to 80, so on and so forth. But I have a pretty good grasp of what each class brings to the table, and I kind of want to put them all here in this video. Just keep in mind that things are subject to change. We haven't seen the patch notes, of course, so you know, some things could get tweaks. I don't think the tweaks are going to be that crazy that this list isn't relevant, but just keep that in mind. With that said, let's dive on in. Alright, starting this thing off with the class I'm very likely going to be picking, and that is the Barbarian. The Barbarian by far has the worst leveling experience from 1 to like 75, 80-ish, and at no point during the leveling do it feel good to play the class at all. I can't really see a logical reason for anyone picking this class outside of just liking melee classes and generally liking the Barbarian like I do. From a perspective of a player who's kind of new or want to try something out for a new season, I think there's so many other classes that just does it way better, and Barbarian would be the last on the list for me if I was a new player to pick the class. Once you transition into the mid and end game, it gets slightly better, but the reality is right now what you have as your tools are Thorns builds, which once you hit like level 50 you get to world tier, well maybe 60, 70-ish, you get to world tier 4. Unless you have a razor plate, you really don't have a lot of damage, so that build kind of falls off until you get one. And then you have Hoda, but if you watch my last video you know that they're looking at Hoda, and if I have to base it off of anything Blizzard has done with Barb, they've only gonna nerf it. In my opinion, that's what they're probably gonna end up doing, because that's what they always do when it comes to Barb. I know some people are saying, well, Whirlwind works really well. It absolutely only works whenever you have Bold Chieftain, you have Echoing Fury, you have Dire Whirlwind, you have literally every single thing you need to make it work. If you're leveling with Whirlwind until then, you're just don't know what you're doing, because it just doesn't do well. And that's kind of the problem with the class. It just needs everything to work, and even when it gets everything it needs, it's still weaker than every other class, relatively speaking. And just keep in mind, everything I'm talking about is relative to the other classes. You absolutely can get to the end game with the Barbarian. You absolutely can do all the content with the Barbarian, but at all times you're doing it worse than every other class, and because of that, it just doesn't make sense for me to pick it as a class. I'm still picking it because I'm a sadist, but in terms of like a tier list, if I'm placing it, I'm placing it at C. It just doesn't make sense to me. Next we're going to be talking about is the Sorcerer, and the Sorcerer is an interesting class because the class has a lot of good mobility on it once you get everything you need. I love the fact that it's mobile and it has a lot of interactive buttons. At least from a defensive perspective, it has a lot of interaction, but I think it suffers from defense even though it has a lot of defensive skills, mainly because of the way resistances work, the fact that it doesn't have a lot of armor on this tree. I'm good enough of a player to build around defenses enough that it doesn't feel so bad, but the average Sorceress players are probably going to suffer a little bit more. Damage wise, she does good damage on her ice builds, but like her fire builds don't do well. I mean, the fireball meme is okay, I guess. The fireball, bouncing fireball thing does okay. Incinerate, firewall, whatever, all those are just mediocre and bad. They're not good. The lightning stuff is okay. It doesn't scale as well as just straight up ice stuff, and so because of that, I just don't think she's that great. She feels fun, at least from an early leveling perspective. She can do all the content very easy, but when you start to hit that like 80 plus and you're starting to really push, that's when you start to notice the weaknesses of her, and because of that, I'm gonna put her as a high B tier. Next we're going to be talking about the Necromancer, and the Necromancer in my opinion has a very good early game, very strong, all the way up until pretty much the entire time. The leveling experience is pretty good. He does suffer with move speed at all times, and even once you solve for it with a lot of the aspects that he needs, and he's still very slow, which is in my opinion the worst part of him. I do think whenever he's facing off against like bosses, he had fortify issues. I know a lot of you are saying, well, the Bone Spirit works well. I imagine they're going to change it, and in a lot of cases I think there's like some minor like abuse with that skill, like most of the builds in the end game, except for maybe Druid and NATO. Outside of Bone Spirit, the other builds are kind of whatever. I think once they actually buff the skills properly in a meaningful way, like the blood skills, the shadow skills, maybe make the minions a little bit easier for players to figure out, and then maybe bring down Bone Spear. I think only then does the class feel like a high tier class. I think it's like, right now, I would put it as a high A tier right now. I don't think it's a S tier like others like to place it. I think it's too reliant on Bone Spear to be a S tier, and I do expect it to be nerfed in the next coming league, so we'll see how it goes. But as far as I'm concerned, Necromancer is a high A tier. Next, onto the Rogue, and this is also the other class I'm very likely going to play. I'm leaning towards Rogue, a little bit more towards Barbarian, but Rogue, in my opinion, has pretty much everything that every class struggles with, like, built in. Just straight up good. It has really good mobility early game, really good damage at all times, great viability and build diversity, as it can play so many different builds that work. But I very seldomly see any build that isn't like viable in the end game. I see it's really fast. I think it's strong at all times. It has really good crit scaling, really good Vaughn application with puncture and just exploit. And at no time do I feel like I'm weak on this class. I would argue that I think it's like overtuned as a class. The only thing that it struggles with is defense, and the defense is not even like something you can't solve for relatively easy, since you have all the tools you need to solve for it. And then the rest of the problems that like all the other classes have, like the Bard, for example, need every single aspect, and it needs to solve for a lot of things. The Rogue doesn't necessarily have that problem. He can have very little investment and be very strong, and the only thing he really has to correct is defense. And if you're an above average player, I think average or above, you can easily like get around the defense problems by just simply being semi-competent at playing the class. So for me, I think the class is very overtuned. I think it's a high S tier because, and compared to all the other classes when they're not bugged, I know some of you are thinking, well, this class does this in 2 seconds. Yeah, those are bug classes and they're abusing some type of mechanic that isn't working. When we're talking about when it comes down to functioning as it should be, I think the Rogue is a clear outstanding class. And honestly, I can't imagine why this class survives so many nerfs. I mean, it gets little baby nerfs to like its twisting blades and then buffs on everything else. And it gets some little baby nerfs on Dark Shroud, and that's because like that's the only real defensive skill that it has. But at the end of the day, like, I still think the class is so much stronger than everything else, and I don't know how it escaped so many nerfs. But for me, it's pretty obvious that if I'm looking to play the season and have the most fun and still feel strong through the whole entire leveling experience, Rogue is just the answer to that. But yeah, that's what I'm picking, and it's S tier. Finally, let's talk about the Druid. And I will say early game, it struggles. Up until level 50 is just not good. That's when you start to see it like really shine. It does have the same issue Barbarian has, except for not as bad in my opinion. I think the worst part on top of that is the fact that some of his best builds are requiring to have very specific uniques. It kind of feels like the skill was built with the unique in mind, and the unique wasn't really built to complement the skill, but more so make the skill work. I don't really like that aspect of the Druid. At least that's what it felt like to me when I played the Druid compared to other classes, that in order to really make it work, I mean, Sword has this problem a little bit too on his fireball skills, but that doesn't really work, honestly. But compared to other classes, I do feel like you have to have these specific uniques to really make the Druid work. When he gets them, he's really good and can complete all the content, but until then, he kind of is okay. I think when it comes down to it, I think Druid is a A-tier class overall, mainly because his in-game actually ramps really well, and his Paragon gets a lot of really good multipliers. So for me, A-tier for the Druid. But yeah, that's my thoughts on the Druid. Alright, and there you have it. That is my tier list thoughts about Season 1 and what classes does what and what you should probably do. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Again, I've played every single class, but I'm not like the best at all the classes. Of course, you know, so my opinion may differ from some of yours, but let me know down in the comments what you think. And with that said, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Later.